And my father's routine has been solid, and he's still working in his 70s, has been solid his entire life. The guy does not go home after work. He goes to work early by 2 hours. He works until 6 o'clock, and he goes home and he pets his dog. This is the guy's routine, and he's missing, not answering his phone. That is a red alert. I called 911. I immediately drove, towards where they live, which is an hour and a half away.
This is the Q Dropped podcast. Stories of relationships torn apart by QAnon. Okay, this is going to date me a little bit, but let's go back to New Year's Eve, 1999. In the months preceding the new year, fear had been spreading about the Y2K virus. Some insisted the world as we knew it would end, as computers everywhere were predicted to become incapable of dealing with dates in the year 2000. It was the beginning of the information age, when banks and airlines and identity systems had all just been digitized. Many predicted all of the world's most crucial systems would fail. We would be unable to access our money or any records stored digitally. Banks would become useless. The government would be rendered ineffective. And in some cases, we might not even be able to start our cars. While some people panicked, others were skeptical that Y2K would cause any significant problems. I was 22. I had already spent the better part of my life on computers and didn't truly believe anything would come of the millennium bug, as some people called it. Though I did love to speculate and fantasize about my student debt suddenly being wiped out or having a couple of extra weeks off from college. I lived with my cousin, who was equally skeptical, but also didn't mind the idea of being debt-free in the new year. Together, we decided to watch New Zealand count down to the year 2000, just to see if anything extraordinary happened. It was sometime in the afternoon, and with the uncertainty posed by the Y2K scare, television channels were covering the new year on the other side of the international date line. We watched as they counted down in Auckland. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And suddenly our television screen went black. In that moment, while I was likely exclaiming obscenities, adrenaline ripped through my body. My hair stood on end. I hadn't really believed anything would happen, but here we were, staring at a black screen after the first few cities have rung in the new year. Was this it? Was I going to have to fashion a spear from my shower curtain rod to catch seagulls for dinner? Were we in danger of being raided by our neighbors for our canned goods? How many days would our 4 jugs of water last? But before I could answer any of those questions, the screen flickered back on, centered on a reporter's face who was apologizing for technical difficulties. Exchanging glances with my cousin, it took us both a minute to come down and realize that everyone was okay and this wasn't the apocalypse after all. We laughed, nervously at first, still trying to reassure each other everything was fine. And then we howled. It's a story we both tell whenever the topic of Y2K comes up, and we always laugh. But what I realized in that moment is that even if it meant my debt was wiped out, or I didn't have to go to work anymore, or I no longer had to file my taxes, I didn't want our society to crumble. I didn't like that feeling. It's anxiety on crack. For a brief, solitary moment, the world was ending, and I did not like it at all. It seems, though, that others were almost hopeful that the world would come crashing down around us. Some people were downright giddy about the idea as they stocked up on unperishables and hoarded gallons of clean water. People like our guest's mom. Meet Dan.
Like the year 2000, for instance, like most people didn't hold hands praying as the new year came in. That was how I did it. And she would like prep with canned goods, and she had like like 2-liter bottles of Coca-Cola or 7-Up and stuff, and she would put 2 drops of like bleach in there and have our garage filled with that, and took money out of the bank and doomsday prepped and believed in deep state conspiracy theories, and things like that. Before it was really well organized, but she was already sort of doing that stuff.
Despite the fact that Dan's mom was a conspiracy theorist throughout much of his life, he looks back on the old days fondly.
I grew up in a small North Dakota town, a population of about 16 or 17,000 people. And I had a relatively happy childhood as I remember it. There wasn't any at the time, real huge rifts in our relationship or family structure. Growing up was generally pretty happy.
And he got along well with his parents.
I was close to my mother. I would regularly see her and talk to her while I was in college.
Dan's family was devout and heavily involved in the church.
I was raised in a Baptist home, very religious and very far right leaning. It was an experience going out to like California mega churches and being a part of people in these large congregations, speaking in tongues. I was witnessing a lot of interesting sects of religion.
Their commitment to their faith was more than the average family who attended church each Sunday. It seems as though Dan's entire world revolved around his religion.
I spent a lot of time every Sunday, every Wednesday for Bible study, and then even some more after that.
The religious roots in his family ran deep and began long before Dan was born.
My parents met at a Bible study. My mother used to be a missionary in Europe, and what she would do would be like bringing pamphlets and like materials, religious materials, across the Iron Curtain into Eastern Europe.
As a child, Dan's parents encouraged him to take up religious extracurricular activities, and he happily took their advice and attended a club hosted by their church.
Something called Awana, which stands for Approved Workmen Are Not Ashamed, and it's basically like a church version of Boy Scouts.
Being raised in a right-wing, deeply religious home rubbed off on Dan.
I would self-described as Republican, and I voted for George Bush for the first time I was eligible to vote. I'm not proud to say. I remember it was more like that's just because, and I didn't challenge any ideals at that point.
But as is the case with many ex-religious and previously right-wing people, things began to change for Dan when he moved out and went to college. He met new people, expanded his understanding of the world, and when he entered the workforce, he began to see things in a different light.
I guess I began to change my political viewpoints on the world when I had moments of disillusionment from the casualties of my friends in the war in Iraq. And I also do a lot of traveling for my job, working for an airline. Just over and over, seeing how things are done differently in different places. I felt that may have contributed to, say, what I'm seeing on television versus what I'm seeing in Amman, Jordan, or something like that is a lot different. And the way that I was treated dispelled lots of the myths or whatever it was that was hyped up. I think that sort of made me more and more probably left-leaning.
Finally, when Obama was elected, he realized his worldview had truly shifted. The political divisions in Dan's family began to bubble to the surface.
A lot of Islamophobia at that time, those types of things were being emailed in group emails about, further conspiracies that Barack Obama's secretly a Muslim, that he's not really an American citizen. And I would argue with my mom and family about those types of things, but it didn't cause such a rift that I could not sit down for Thanksgiving with them.
This is common in all the stories of people we've explored on this podcast. We all recall a time when disagreeing about political positions was not a relationship-ending thing. We could talk to our loved ones and even engage in lively, sometimes heated debate about our differing view of the world. But then we'd set it aside and just be family again. We could move past it, see each other's humanity, and understand that party lines shouldn't be why a family becomes estranged. This is how it was for Dan as he began to see the world with his own eyes and found it was much different than he'd been raised to believe. Dan's faith would become weaker and weaker, and it all started when he visited his uncle as a teen.
There was a time when I had to go to my uncle's place for a raft camp.
But when Dan arrived, his uncle took him to church.
It was this very big California church in this place called Novato, California.
Dan describes one of those prosperity gospel televangelist churches, accommodating many multiple thousands of people.
Everyone's like playing like our God is an awesome God, and then like speaking in tongues. And they called me down to the center. So the preacher came along and he would touch everybody on their forehead, and then they would go into that hypnotic state or trance. And when it came to my forehead, I just stood there. My eyes were closed. I was willing to have whatever experience happened, but I wasn't conditioned into that type of a thing to have happened. So nothing happened because he just touched my forehead, and that's all there was. But I was ashamed and embarrassed and curious why all of a sudden the Holy Spirit wasn't moving in me like it was everyone else of the other 19 people. So nothing happened there, and that placed some doubt in my mind.
Since then, Dan's faith only deteriorated. Today, Dan considers himself an atheist. He lives with his partner of 7 years and his stepson. And of course, as his worldview changed and he shed his belief system, there was no longer a need to call himself a Republican.
I consider myself to be very liberal. I vote Democrat.
Despite these drastic changes in his worldview, he and his parents still got along. He would visit often and check in a lot, and even though they saw the world differently, they were still able to set that aside for the sake of their relationship. But as it seems to be the case with each of the stories we tell on this podcast, the pandemic hit and everything changed. When we come back, we'll hear how the pandemic flipped everything upside down for Dan. We want to take this opportunity to thank our patrons. Without you, we couldn't make the show. You make it possible, so thank you. If you want to support the show, head on over to patreon.com/qdropped. The link is also in the show notes. And choose your tier. They start at just $3 per month, and patrons get access to plenty of extra clips from each episode, including some raw video clips of the interview itself. It's a great way to be able to put a face to a name. Thank you so much, patrons, and now back to this week's episode. Dan recalls those first days of the pandemic when we had no idea what was about to happen.
The announcement where the president declared there was a pandemic, and we saw, those first, that whatever day that was in March, I began asking them to be careful with COVID-19. And we're talking about COVID-19 1.0. We don't know what is going on at the time. We don't know how it's spreading. We don't know if it's airborne. We don't know if it's on surfaces. She works at a hospital. He works at a front-facing customer service job. And I'm very concerned for their well-being. And I ask them to observe social distancing and to just stay home.
Dan has, since the beginning, taken COVID very seriously. He even volunteered to be a part of the initial Pfizer vaccine trials. So when his mother planned to attend a large event with lots of people, he was immediately concerned.
One of my cousins, or my mother's sister in Wisconsin, was holding a wedding for her daughter. And it was a larger wedding by my definition, like around, I don't know if it was around 100 people. I wasn't there, but I very seriously asked her not to go. And she insisted upon going, and that there was not very many people there and that would be fine. And I said, if you have to go and if you really must go, can you please wear a mask? Can you please wear an N95 mask, which I actually had from my previous job where we had the Ebola scare and we had to clean things. And I asked her to wear a mask and she said, okay, I'll wear a mask and I'll try to stay outside.
Dan quickly found out that this did not happen.
And so I started seeing these Facebook posts of what you would imagine, right? A large wedding in Wisconsin with a bunch of like super conservative people completely ignoring social distancing measures. And they're wearing like the opera masks you get from a party favor store with a little elastic band like over your eyes. And that was totally a fuck you. And I really took offense to that.
Unsurprisingly, it took no time at all before Dan's mom was deep into the COVID conspiracy theories.
It wasn't just that she was somebody who wasn't big into participating with COVID measures. It was that began turning into, not only was it what she didn't want to do, it was turning into these completely obscene, versions of what was going on.
For Dan, this kind of came out of left field. Despite the fact that his mother had believed in conspiracy theories in the past, she'd gotten her children vaccinated. Dan tells me that they frequented the doctor's office growing up and admits that if anything, they visited the doctor too much. His mother clearly had had trust in modern medicine and vaccines when he was a child.
And all of a sudden now she's having more tendencies against vaccines before there even was a vaccine. And now she has no interest whatsoever about listening to COVID tests and science behind that. And while she's working at a hospital, but not as a person who administers medicine.
My mom insisted that COVID was no big deal and the tests were unnecessary. We heard that Catherine's mom in episode 3 thought that the COVID tests would give her cancer or a brain bleed. Dan's mother has a different take.
And she was telling me that the tests were predetermined negative or positive.
Her conspiracy theories about COVID-19 and the COVID vaccines began to bubble over in every conversation Dan had with her.
Of course, the Bill Gates microchipping thing comes up. The limited lifespan that I'll have, I'll be dead in years. Please, what if I turn into a potato? What would that do to my partner? If Trump says it, they'll take ivermectin. I don't know what version they took, but they definitely took it.
One of the many things Dan struggles to understand is how such devout Christians can rationalize worshiping a man like Trump.
The life of Donald Trump doesn't jive very well, in my opinion, with those Christian ideals, but yet they will have blind support for him.
As is the case with my parents and so many other elderly people who have succumbed to the QAnon phenomenon, a complete inability to understand the dynamics of the internet is at play with Dan's parents.
Imagine growing up and inherently trusting what comes across on a television screen. And then all of a sudden now you have anybody with all of the platforms that are out there being platformed, having their own channel and looking at it with equal credibility. How is one delude themselves to believe that that urine injected into one's bloodstream is a genetic treatment?
Okay, your first instinct may be to laugh, I know, but what Dan says is a very real conspiracy theory being pushed by anti-vaxxers. Specifically Christopher Key, who calls himself the vaccine police. He's told his followers that God has given us all we need to fight off the COVID-19 virus. He says the antidote is urine therapy. Urine therapy has been around for years, popping up again and again in the online wellness community. Essentially, health gurus swear that drinking your own urine provides a plethora of health benefits. When the pandemic hit, many of these same gurus insisted that drinking your own urine will protect you from COVID-19. But in recent months, some QAnoners have started talking about injecting urine into your bloodstream. They claim it will counteract the imagined side effects from the COVID-19 vaccine. Dan is not exaggerating. Folks are actually talking about shooting urine into their veins. I really hope this doesn't need to be said, but I'm going to say it anyway. Urine is made up of waste that your body is trying to get rid of. There are no health benefits to be gained from drinking your own urine unless you're lost in the desert without water. In fact, drinking and especially injecting your own urine can result in sepsis, which can lead to death, and almost did for one man in 2011. I will link the case in the show notes, along with other sources of information on the topic, so you can educate yourself about why, when mommy told you as a toddler not to drink your own pee, she was right. For Dan, this was just one of 1,000 conspiracy theories and remedies he has had to teach himself to ignore. His relationship with his mother became more of a challenge with each passing day.
And those moments were the ones where it was like, I can't even level with you as a person anymore.
That's when Dan jumped into his own research to try and make sense of why his mom had become so extreme and why his relationship with her was crumbling away despite every effort to hang on to it.
I didn't understand what was going on yet, though. I didn't understand what was fueling it. I identified it as QAnon because of a watermark on one of their things, just a Q, and then like where we go all hashtag and on some of the things that I'm being sent. And then I was able to find that identifier QAnon, and then I was able quickly on Reddit to find QAnon Casualties as a user and find other people with exactly the same stuff going on. And I was like, okay, all right. And I was really glued to that.
QAnon Casualties is a subreddit, which is a topic-based board on the social media platform Reddit. This subreddit is devoted to one thing and one thing only: stories of people who have lost a loved one to QAnon, just like this podcast. Users post anonymously about the struggles they're facing with a parent, a partner, a son or a daughter, or a friend who has slid down the Q rabbit hole and turned into someone they no longer recognize. QAnon Casualties is where I went when I discovered my parents had succumbed to the Q nonsense. Sadly, there are very few stories of people drawn away from Q, but it is a place where people like me and like Dan and like all of our guests on this podcast can go to talk about what we're experiencing and find support from people who are experiencing the exact same thing. For me and for Dan, QAnon Casualties is like an online support group, and it has gotten each one of us through some very tough times. I had to thank Dan when I first hopped on a call with him because he's a moderator on the QAnon Casualties subreddit, which means he volunteers his time to ensure the forum is a safe place for us to vent our frustration. Without people like Dan, the subreddit would likely be overrun by Q and MAGA trolls, and the people who truly need the platform would be scared away. When Dan first discovered QAnon Casualties, however, he was like everyone else who just found out they had a Q in the family. He was looking for a way to fix his mom.
And I wanted to know for a very long time, how can I bring them out of this? Her, especially. I don't see QAnon Casualties, people going on there having breakthroughs, though. They are lots of the people who are on there are at the same point. And the point is that they have tried reasoning and arguing and it's not going anywhere, and they are blowing it up in their face off. And what do I do?
This is the first thing most of us do. The moment we realize we've lost someone we love to this cult, we hop online and begin searching for ways to deconstruct their suddenly nonsensical worldview. When it happened to us, my brother and I spent countless hours researching and reading and reaching out to experts. I recall reading Mick West's book called Escaping the Rabbit Hole: How to Debunk Conspiracy Theories Using Facts, Logic, and Respect, which is a must-read, by the way. The link is in the show notes. And I was blown away by the ease with which he destroyed these theories. In desperation, I reached out to him. And I was pleasantly surprised when he responded. I had asked him, I probably begged him to tell me the secret to drawing a loved one out of Q, and his dead honest answer was hard to hear. He gave me a lot of solid advice for dealing with them as they are, but the overarching message was that I kind of had to take them as they were and play the long game, which still wouldn't guarantee success. It took a while for it to really sink in that my parents were just gone, and in their place were these people I don't really know. When you scroll through QAnon Casualties, you'll come across a post every once in a while from a new subscriber asking the very same questions I asked Mick West. How do I get my Q out of the rabbit hole? How do I debunk the theories? And how do I get my parents back? Even after starting this podcast, I get people asking when we will feature a success story. My friends, a success story on this podcast is unlikely, simply because there are so few. For the vast majority of us, we eventually come to the realization that there is nothing we can do about this. We have to simply accept that we have lost someone to this madness and find a way to move on with or without them in our lives. Dan realized the futility of fighting a long time ago.
So for every one thing I can debunk, they can find 10 more things to send to me. And if I try to conversationally engage her, she goes into what you may call whataboutism. But what about this? But what about this? But what about this? And so on. Because there will never be a moment of you finally have admitted to what your horribly misguided things on the internet have done. There's no eureka moment that will happen. There's no payoff. In my situation, this will never come. There's no words which can be said to stop her from going into QAnon conspiracy theories, which make her emotionally feel better about her own mortality.
Today, Dan understands that fighting back and trying to debunk their theories might actually make things worse.
That is attacking them at their core, and they will go defensive to that, and they will then feel bad about it. And when they're sad, depressed people, which they mostly are, in my opinion, what do you do to feel better? You read more QAnon theories. When they're reading about these truths, they feel like they don't feel stupid. They feel entitled or smart or emboldened, and they feel an endorphin rush, and they get hyped up about it, and they read more and more and more. And it is like also concurrent, internet addiction. If you ever go to, some of the established QAnon websites and look at just any random user's post history of how frequently they are talking about things, it's above that of what is normal. Not only is it a lifestyle, it's becoming a community. That's where they will go to feel right and whole again, to fill the void of where their family may be missing.
Like many couples who fall down the rabbit hole together, one of them tends to be the leader. In the case of Dan's parents, it's his mother. Dan finds that his father is much easier to get along with.
My dad will come over still in the summer times and help us like gardening, and he's over here, and we can easily go about our day without having, any conversations about those types of things.
But the power Dan's mother seems to have over his father is palpable.
He will not take the COVID-19 vaccine. He is in his mid-70s, a quadruple bypass patient, so history of heart disease, one who would be high risk for contracting COVID. And after pleading and pleading and pleading, will not take the vaccine because he's being told he'll die if he takes it.
Dan tried to convince his father to get medical advice before ruling out a vaccine altogether.
Let's talk to your doctor about it. Let's go in and do whatever the doctor you've known for 25 years and take the advice.
Dan feels as though his dad is collateral damage in his mother's obsession. Like he probably wouldn't have reached these conclusions if his mother wasn't so deeply down the rabbit hole.
And I don't want to give him a free pass. I tend to be lighter on him than I do my mother. But he doesn't watch the news. He's not somebody who can browse the internet. He doesn't do much any of that. And so he's cut off just because functionally he's not good at anything digital at all.
With both of his parents choosing to remain unvaccinated, Dan felt he had to take a step back and stop visiting them or having them to his home.
But I was not going to be the person who goes over there and gets them sick. I will not have that on my whatever, if I even should feel guilty about it, but I will not have that on my conscience. And I made that decision that, this isn't going to come from me. How they have not contracted COVID-19 and where they live and with the case rates blows my mind.
It wasn't long before other aspects of Dan's relationship with his parents began to succumb under the weight of his mother's obsession.
Well, our interactions became toxic and poisonous. Somebody was like, why don't you talk to your mom about this and just ask her what's going on? In such a way that any normal person would ask their parent how things are going to lead in to figure out what's going on. Well, then I started thinking about how much I cannot communicate. And after consulting therapists and after trying the things they're doing, I have to put this hard boundary in where I don't have this frequent contact with her or dialogue because it's that poisonous.
Dan soon found he had no choice but to draw a line in the sand.
I don't initiate conversations with my mother. I don't answer the phone if my mom calls only once. She's got to call multiple times, like someone's dying and there's an emergency before I pick up the phone. I don't let her in the house. I only talk to her when she's outside with my dad looking at a garden. I strictly will try to talk about tomatoes.
Dan pled with his mother to respect his boundaries, and she still pushes them.
After multiple attempts of setting a boundary, saying, let's look at this, let's agree to disagree or not talk about it to each other, cannot be done, will not be respected. It shows no respect for people's boundaries or rules.
Despite Dan's wishes, his mother would constantly send him messages on every platform, from email and Instagram to Facebook and Twitter.
She's all blocked on all of those things. So I only really have like a dial line and text messages, which I've asked, please just send me dog pictures. And I will still get just the worst of it. And of course, she just hopes to hear something back. It's probably better for her to hear an argument than complete total silence. But I don't engage because it does two things. It pushes her further into conspiracies, and it changes no one's mind, and it's not good for my mental health. It doesn't get any better by just talking it through. She's certainly not interested in changing her mind.
Today, Dan barely sees his parents.
I don't go over for Christmas. I don't go over for Thanksgiving. I don't have birthday celebrations with them. I don't have all of those normal relations. I don't have regular phone calls where I talk about my day with them. On my birthday, not this year, but last year, she dropped off presents and I didn't answer the door. And she left them there. And the presents were like forpatriots.com. If you want to edit that up, feel welcome to. But like the presents were all prepper stuff. And the last time I saw my mom, she was wearing a black, American flag, some patriot gear, as we, describe it here, shirt, and like black jeans. So it's like almost like this weird, like 60-year-old woman emo phase.
Dan says he didn't make the choice to take a step back from his parents lightly.
So this is the last years of their life, and I'm not being present for those things. You don't just do that without a conscience if you like your parents or love your parents.
All of this has had an immensely negative impact on Dan's relationship with other people he cares about as well.
But it has severely affected the relations with my father, my mother, my sister, all of my aunts and uncles on one side on my mother's side of the family, most of my cousins who I would associate at family gatherings. It has in almost every way ostracized me from my nuclear family.
Expressing a sentiment we've heard so many times before, Dan feels he no longer recognizes the people who raised him.
It's just like they are these beings out there who used to be my family, who are out there, but they're not just dead. I don't wish them to be dead, but it's like they are dead to me, but they're also not, because they're actively offending and traumatizing you as you're going on.
But he still feels he needs to keep at least some of the lines of communication open in case of emergencies. This past summer, the feeling was reinforced when his father suddenly went missing.
And my father's routine has been solid, and he's still working in his 70s, has been solid his entire life. The guy does not go home after work. He goes to work early by 2 hours. He works until 6 o'clock, and he goes home and he pets his dog. This is the guy's routine, and he's missing, not answering his phone. That is a red alert. I called 911. I immediately drove, towards where they live, which is an hour and a half away.
After the break, Dan arrives at his parents' home.
The Q Drop podcast is produced by Porthos Media, a Canadian independent audio, video, and written content company. If you're in need of audio or video production, editing, or copywriting, visit www.porthosmedia.net. The Q Drop podcast theme song, Mother of Alice, is written, performed, and produced by Porthos Media, so get in touch if you need original music for your upcoming project.
Dan didn't know what to expect as he drove the hour and a half to his parents' house, but much to his relief, he found his father was alive and well. It turns out the emergency was a marital dispute.
Ended up getting involved in their personal issues between each other.
The experience was off-putting, and things that were said and done were enough to make Dan want to take their guns away.
You don't even want to have guns around you. There's no reason for them to have guns. So I just said, I'm going to be going hunting. I'm going to grab the deer rifle and probably take that with me because I'm going to go out here in the fall.
When Dan's mother agreed, she took him downstairs to where the guns were kept. That's where Dan discovered that his parents had more guns than he'd realized.
She's like, this gun? And I was like, what gun is that? Because she's buying more. And so she had purchased a handgun, and she thought I was asking for the handgun.
Out of concern, Dan ended up taking the guns with him.
And I don't think that they were going to be using their guns and resulting in violence. It was a precautionary step that I took in the moment, not knowing what was going on as you're wrapping your head around it. If I didn't answer my phone then, I would have missed all of that, and I'm glad that I picked up. So there's sort of a difficult line to have, being I just don't answer the phone ever. My parents are older, and there will be time they will die, and there will be times where their medication, if they go to a hospital before they die, if I completely ignore all communications, I'll miss that. The best I can do is to not bite on the things they're saying and do bite on the things that are about a dog or, a family member. And it looks great. Oh, I see that you're running the snowboard. The superficial conversations that we may still have, I will respond to that, but I will not respond to the other stuff, which mostly has been letting off. But that's all I can do to sort of give them an M&M or a piece of candy when they, just make that the rewarding system and not give them a big reaction, which is more than just, for their sake. It's part of indoctrination.
I think I read in one of your posts that your grandma had COVID.
Yeah, and she didn't die. She had COVID-19, and she was hospitalized for weeks.
I asked Dan how his 90-year-old grandmother caught COVID.
It could have been last Thanksgiving that they took her out of her memory care unit. But they took her to a family gathering.
Luckily, the care home she lived in required that residents receive the COVID vaccines, and she was inoculated against the virus before she caught it. Dan struggles with that in a sort of survivor's guilt. Despite being grateful his grandmother survived, he wishes so many others could have as well.
It's not fair that and I don't want ill on my grandmother, but it's not fair that something like that will happen with QAnon mom managing it and all the crap going around. And there's people who have done far less besides, people have literally walked by COVID positive people and died. early on, and that's not fair. It's not fair how it spreads.
It was the day of the midterm elections when Dan made an unsettling discovery.
The narrative that the election has been stolen and manipulated by computerized ballot machines or mail-in ballots and Antifa spies and people taking away ballots, all of that was fed to my mother, and she was very much involved in believing it, very adamant about it being a fraudulent election, and so I have her on the only social media which I haven't blocked her on is Snapchat, and I don't know why. Just that she is on there. I don't again engage her, but she does like see. I guess it's a way of her seeing my little stuff, like me living my day that I let her look at, and I could see that she creeps it because it shows you who looks at it, and it's just garbage video stuff. Anyway, she had like a message she was sending out, and she referred to my father as her husband. She was like recapping her day, and she I cringed, but she's like, hey guys, I took off work today to be, I'm a poll worker. So I went, and went to the election, and my election boss guy, he said he didn't need me, but I said, I really, really wanted to work it. I wanted to be there. And so he let me come in, and he let me come in. And so I just did that, and I forgot to vote whoever was for Senate. And I can't believe I did that. But now I'm cleaning out our garden before this snowstorm comes in. And this is how I discovered that she was at some capacity and self-identified as being a poll worker. And I know somebody who's in our city council in the town she lives, and talked to him, and it's legitimate. And I don't know exactly what she did. And I don't know. I don't believe that she was engaged in voter fraud, but I believe what happened is that she got trolled by Trump's big lie so hard that she signed up to be a part of their election in whatever capacity they let her to, which is very disturbing to me, because she clearly, in my opinion, is easily influenceable, excitable, impulsive, and somebody who could be taken advantage of. She's been political as far as voting, but she has never been involved in an election, the functional part of the election. She does not do that until all of a sudden now. And she is not the right person for that job.
Dan clarified to me that he doesn't believe his mother was there to manipulate results or intimidate voters. He assures me she's not aggressive like that. It's more about what her presence as a poll worker represents.
If she's turning out there, then somebody else is too. She's not independently doing this. She's not capable of it.
Dan is scared of who might be influencing people like his mom. He worries that some of those people might be more aggressive than her, and in 2 years, when it's possible that Trump is on the ballot again, he wonders what lengths they'll go to make sure their candidate wins.
This is why in America, anywhere there's a democratic vote, you need to have a real bulletproof process on how that's done. No one should be able to single-handedly, or even two people, be able to, twist and throw things out.
Dan assures me, though, that if he ever did find out that his mother had tampered with votes or tried to intimidate people enacting their civic duty, he would not hesitate to turn her in.
I would never give her a free pass because she's somebody in my family. If I ever were to hear of any sort of malice, I would be equally inclined to go to whoever the right person is to go to over that, as I would hearing about it from anyone else.
Dan says that these events have given him anxiety about the future of elections in America.
Again, our democracy in America is being put to the test.
Dan is also worried about the safety and well-being of his parents.
What scares me the most is that they ignore COVID restrictions until it's too late to be helped, and then they expire from that in a suffocation death with their own lungs being filled with fluid from a viral pneumonia.
Looking toward the future, he wonders what QAnoners as a whole are capable of.
What types of more extreme acts will they do if not even if they're encouraged about to do it? What if it's out of frustration with your own cult philosophy? Then you definitely have people who have always been the type who believe in conspiracy theories, but never before until being put on social media steroids do they have the power to have platformed individuals and organize in communities.
To cope, Dan spends his free time on QAnon Casualties.
My day is a bed of broken families every day. When I go onto this subreddit business, I'm reading through people's posts. It's a very hard thing to talk about. It's a lot of baggage, and it's really weird shit. And when it's somebody you know and care and love about, it's a lot to have going on.
The subreddit provides an outlet for Dan like it does for so many of us.
This little online therapy group, as therapeutic as it can get. And I do use that. And I do use interviews like this to think about how I feel and think and bounce opinions off other people too, because it's helpful.
I asked Dan if he had any advice for others out there dealing with a QAnon loved one, and he said this.
Logic did not get them to where they're at, and logic will not get them out of where they're at. It's not about it being extreme. It's not about necessarily it being rational. It's not it's about filling an emotional hole that they have, and to address it accordingly, and to help them and to work and try to steer somebody away from that if you can. It should be looked at that way, and you will save yourself a lot of anguish if you're able to look at it in that scope, in my opinion.
He says that you shouldn't feel ashamed of doing what you have to do to protect your own mental health.
And it is okay to have a boundary and a healthy separation for yourself. It's not fair, and that stuff is being put on us. It's not our fault, but it is our responsibility to deal with it and whatever is best for your own psyche.
I want to thank Dan for joining us for this episode of the Q Dropped podcast, and a heartfelt thank you to him for helping to run the QAnon Casualties subreddit. I recommend checking it out if you haven't already. The link is in the show notes. We will be back next week with another story for you, so make sure you're subscribed on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube to be notified when that gets posted. Check out the bonus content from this episode and all the others on our Patreon and support the show at the same time. The link is in the show notes. Thank you to those who have already become patrons, and thank you all for listening to this episode of the Q Dropped podcast.